The company we chose to interview for our qualitative research project is the International Finance Corporation branch based in South Africa. The IFC is part of the World Bank Group and is responsible for private sector investments in developing countries. The research question we chose is, to what extent does IFC South Africa implement performance appraisals and feedback in order to motivate employees? We conducted 5 semi-structured interviews with employees in different positions within the company, namely a temporary team assistant, a permanent team assistant, a program assistant, an investment analyst, and a senior investment officer. When it came to the interviews, we found that there were a number of factors which influenced the data we received. The most noticeable differences were time working for the company, which ranged from 3 months to 6 years, position within the company, personal definition of motivation, and the different types of feedback and appraisals given and/or received.
On average, we broke up and disassembled the interviews into 50 to 60 open codes per interview using in vivo coding and research-denoted coding. Once all of our open codes were done, we initiated the axial coding stage, segmenting and reassembling the data into distinct and relevant categories. Because the circumstances of each interview differ slightly, we used the constant comparison approach of grounded theory in order to develop our axial codes. This meant moving back and forth between the data and our existing axial codes, constantly considering the data in a different light and ensuring that the established axial codes and their evolving relationships with each other were still relevant. The 8 emerging axial codes were then each separately color-coded, as you can see, in order to clearly distinguish them.
When we opened and axial coded our first 2 interviews, we created more specific axial codes, for example, using the axial code peer review, which we later found out was only present in 1 interview. Hence, it was merged with written/formal feedback and appraisal. Furthermore, we also found that having 4 different axial codes of written, verbal, formal, and informal feedback and appraisal was too specific, and so we decided to merge written and formal feedback and appraisal, as well as verbal and informal feedback and appraisal. This was done due to the fact that there were many instances in which these axial codes were overlapping.
While coding the interviews, we made methodological memos pertaining to our learning experiences. These memos include the already mentioned merging of actual codes, as well as how to better identify certain actual codes in future interviews and mark these accordingly. Once we had the first 2 interviews actual coded, it was significantly easier to actual code the remaining 3 interviews. When it came to theoretical memos, we specified how we derived the specific actual codes from the data. This was done by finding the dividing line between intrinsic motivation and team support, as well as the dividing line between verbal informal feedback and written formal feedback.
In the scheme of our conceptual model, we started out by giving a few examples from our open codes, which show how and why we developed our axial codes. These can be seen as the outermost layer in our model. The in vivo open code, something that keeps me on my toes, corresponds to the axial code of intrinsic motivation in the lower left-hand corner of our conceptual model in this case, while the descriptive open code, feedback given in a structured interview, corresponds to the axial code of written/formal feedback and appraisal. When it came to selective coding, we identified the main themes which interlinked our axial codes. The axial codes developed are then separated into these themes, determined by a common aspect. The main themes which consistently emerged when comparing the different interviews to each other throughout the coding process are feedback, appraisal, and motivation. These can be seen one step closer to the center in our conceptual model and are depicted by the arrows leading away from the axial codes. When considering these 3 main themes throughout all the interviews, the common relationship that we found is that employees at IFC appraise in order to give feedback, which in turn leads to motivation at work. This is illustrated by two more arrows pointing towards our core concepts, feedback-driven motivation. We have selected this as our core category, not only because it is backed by data and supporting literature, but also because it relates directly to the research question that we are investigating, namely due to its ability to measure the extent of feedback and appraisals provided by employees of different hierarchies within IFC.
Reflecting back on our research proposal, we altered our research question from focusing on positive appraisal and feedback to just focusing on appraisal and feedback as a whole. We were surprised to find that negative feedback and appraisals seem to motivate some employees at the IFC more than positive feedback and appraisal. Furthermore, our theoretical framework discussed the effects of feedback and appraisal on motivation, and both were said to increase motivation. This was supported to a large extent in our research, as all employees that we interviewed said that feedback and appraisal increased their motivation, and as such, our theoretical framework has been validated. This brings us to the end of our presentation. We would like to thank you for your attention and wish you the best of luck with your selective coding.